Welcome to Soaring Prophets Live. I am so happy to have this next guest on our show, and I am also happy to have upgraded my co-host because, as you know, Patrick and I don't always get along, and the beautiful co-host that we have chosen this evening, you guys know so well. She is our creative director, our website guru, and also she knows a lot about the subject that is at hand this evening. So Montana, why don't you introduce yourself properly, finally, to our amazing profiteers.
So I come to you today as Pat's replacement. Thank goodness, finally. We've been working at this for a really long time, James and I. But I have a couple of degrees in early brain development. I started and sold a business, a food business, and now I'm currently the executive director of an early learning center. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm so happy to be talking to Tim today.
That's amazing. So not only do we have an amazing co-host that is in-depth and knows a lot of knowledge about this topic, we also have the amazing Tim Fletcher. So as you all know, profiteers, I am going through my own self-discovery, which is why I always leave with let's heal our minds, bodies, and souls together, because I'm in the middle of doing that myself. And while I was doing it, people have said, maybe Montana herself, that I may have some sort of ADHD, but also I have suffered from childhood trauma, and so I started exploring that. And while exploring that, I saw the Theo Von Show, which is a fairly famous comedian and who has a podcast. And then I ran into a show with Tim Fletcher. He is the creator of React, who specifically works with people who suffer from addiction, but he deep dives into complex trauma, or C-PTSD, which is basically childhood experiences on brain development and future mental health. And it's just so interesting. And I can't wait till you start listening to this stuff. All the stuff that you're going to identify in your adult life that is probably linked to something that happened in your childhood is not only revealing, but he also has some amazing strategies and techniques to help you with that. So Tim Fletcher, thank you so much for coming on the show. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background? So we're all about unveiling the stories of champions. And as far as I'm concerned, all of the stuff you have done and all the people you've helped, you are literally a champion. So if you could start at the beginning, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey up until you started React.
Sure. I was actually probably raised in what would be considered a fairly healthy home, but I had a couple deficits that I think were handed to me by my parents, not intentionally, but based on kind of how they were parented and what they were taught was good parenting. And so the first was, we grew up with this very good work ethic, that you got to be productive, you got to work hard. My parents were born in the Great Depression and all of that. And so I never remember my mom ever sitting with her hands not doing something. Even when she was sitting, she was knitting or doing grocery lists or whatever. So it was just drilled into me that work. But really what came out of that was, if you relax, you're being lazy. If you relax, you're being selfish. And so that was drilled into me. So then secondly, I was raised in a very conservative Christian environment. And my parents were all about loving people, but I kind of got a definition of love that I actually now would understand as really codependency. That you give up all your needs, you sacrifice constantly, and you just never set boundaries. You give, give, give. And so I was raised with that. That was a lot of kind of wonderful things about my childhood. But then the third thing was my family was British origin, and so it was just very stoic. And so we could show all of the emotions as long as we only showed them a little bit. We couldn't show them in any big doses. We could talk about emotions, you just couldn't show them too much. And when it came to stress, well, you just dug a little deeper and pushed a little harder and worked a bit harder, but you didn't deal with stress in healthy ways. And so I loved that as a kid. I was a very energetic, active kid that just had amazing resources of energy. And so I remember growing up just loving working 80 hours a week and go, go, go. But then I became a pastor. And then shortly after I became a pastor, I got married just before became a pastor, then I had 3 children in 5 years. And so all of a sudden my life just got full of extra responsibilities, extra busyness. And I was following how I was raised. You got to love everybody. You don't set boundaries. You got to work hard, and you deal with stress by digging deeper. And I burnt myself out at 32 and became very sick, and basically went through 7 years of huge health issues, deep depression, had to resign, was on disability. After I came out of that, I worked on farms because I really knew I couldn't go back to pasturing. So I worked on cattle farms, horse farms, grain farms. And that was actually very therapeutic for me. I did a lot of healing out in nature with animals, just working hard. But then one day, a lady I used to pastor who worked at an addiction treatment center approached me and said, I think we need a male counselor, and I think you're the right guy. And they were the only addiction treatment center in Canada that saw addiction as a symptom of deeper issues, that the person with addiction was actually using drugs to try to solve their pain, and they were trying to understand the pain. But my response at that point was, I think you got the wrong guy. I just don't think that's for me. And I just dropped it. And about 6 months later, she came back and said, I really think you are the guy. Would you at least please come for the interview? So I said, okay, I'll go for the interview. So I went, and they offered me the job, and I said, okay, I'll take it on this condition. I'll do it for 3 months because I don't know if this is for me, etc. And so I agreed to do it. In the first week of sitting and working with people and getting into real deep stuff and watching them respond, I thought to myself, I just had this feeling come over me. I think I finally found where I belong. This is what I'm good at. This is what all my life has prepared me for. This is where I fit. And so it grew from there. And so thankfully, being the treatment center that was really looking at underlying issues, like the word trauma wasn't even in the vocabulary yet. That's over 20 years ago. Complex trauma, that wasn't for another 10 years almost. And so it was just really starting to investigate pain, and not many people were doing it. But then Dr. Gabor Mate from Vancouver, Canada, came along and said every person with addiction he deals with has childhood trauma. And that was the first connection between addiction and trauma. And so I just started to really explore all of that, read everything I could get my hands on, and began based on what I was reading, but also working with clients every day, asking questions, teaching workshops, just refining, getting more information, more knowledge. And it just started to grow. And then people started to say, could you make this more public? And so I started to teach once a week on a Friday to the public. And then everybody in the addiction world was starting to say trauma informed. We got to be trauma informed. This is what addiction is about, trauma. So I got asked to a meeting one day of all the directors of the treatment centers. And I just said, how many of you are willing to change your programs to actually deal with trauma? And they all said, no one. Not one treatment center was willing to change. And I just said, well, something's wrong here. We're all saying trauma is the issue, but why aren't you willing to change? But nobody was willing to because of funding, all kinds of, it changed the length of their program. So I just spent 3 years going, I don't want to start a treatment center. That's not my skill set. I'm not a business person, but somebody's got to do it. So I got to get me a team that is good in business and can manage a treatment center, and I'll do the content and the teaching and counseling and do all of that. So 8 years ago, we started a treatment center. So REACT means Recovery Education for Addiction and Complex Trauma. And once COVID hit, that we had to put that online for clients, and then word got out that stuff was online, and we started getting requests from around the world. Can I take this program? And now we have people from over 30 countries in the world who are taking the online LIFT program. So that's kind of my story. So the bottom line to me is, this wasn't on my radar at any point in my early life. This wasn't what I was looking to do. I just kind of happened upon it, even got pushed with great resistance into it.
Right.
And all of a sudden, like waking up and going, this is where I belong. And then when nobody else would do it, I didn't want to do it, but somebody had to do it, and it's gone from there.
I love all of that. There's so much that I want to get into, but some of the things that caught me when I was listening to you on the Theo Vaughn show was the fact of that you feel like you always have to say yes, and that you get that burnout because you have to say yes all the time. And then the other thing is that you talk about addiction in a different way. Addiction isn't just drinking, doing drugs. It's maybe changing your house every time because you have to have that keep change, or it might be that you overeat or undereat, and all of that is caused by this complex trauma. I think maybe though we should start in what is complex trauma, and where does it start, where does it come from, and then we can go from there.
Yep. Yeah, especially because nowadays the word trauma is thrown around. I'm sure you see this, Tim.
For everything.
Everything. It's the umbrella term for everything. And so people really, really use it.
Yeah. And what I would say I've seen is that our society's developed a definition for trauma that's only partly right.
Yeah.
And so what we really define it as is what I would call big T trauma. Horrific, one-time events that happen that are out of the normal, that a person can't handle, and so they do a ton of damage to the person. But what it's important to realize is that only a small percentage of the population has big T trauma,
right,
whereas over 75% of the population has little t trauma. That's the other part of trauma. And so that's the trauma of neglect. And so big T trauma is something bad happening to you. Little t trauma is something good that should have happened to you but didn't.
Right.
And you go, well, that's invisible trauma. Like nothing bad happened. Well,
right,
in a sense, nothing bad happened to you, but something good didn't happen that should have happened. And so it's hard for people to get their head around, but that's what most people have. So over 75%. So complex trauma means it's ongoing. It's not just that something good didn't happen to you once or something bad happened to you once. That was your daily experience. Your world wasn't safe because mom and dad weren't safe. Brother wasn't safe. Teacher wasn't safe. Bully wasn't safe. You were in a culture that was very racist, so it wasn't safe for you to be in that culture. All of those things then create unsafe environments. So complex trauma usually happens within the home environment as the main source of it, but it can happen within the culture, within different institutions in the culture as well. And it can happen in adult life, but it primarily starts for most people in childhood, often pre-verbal, even before they can talk as infants. And so it shapes all of that. So the key thing to me with complex trauma, especially little t trauma, is it's whenever an emotional need isn't met in a child, the child automatically feels hurt, rejected, something's wrong with me. And so there's a pain of being excuse me, of being hurt, but there's also a pain of an unmet need that's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
So they try to resolve it, but they can't. And so complex trauma is basically unresolved pain due to being hurt or needs not being met, emotional needs particularly. So most parents are good at meeting physical needs, but that's not the issue. It's the emotional needs that aren't being met. And that's where the trauma takes place. So again, you can see a physical injury, but you can't see that emotional injury. So it's almost an invisible trauma that's taking place. But what happens then with the child when they're constant pain that they can't resolve is they go to, I got to adapt. I'm the problem. I must be not good enough. So I need to wear masks. I can't be authentic. Maybe I need to cheat. Maybe I need to manipulate people. Maybe I can't trust people. So they start doing all of these adaptations to survive. The issue is all those adaptations seem to work.
Yeah.
It's not till 20 or 30 years later you go, oh, that I thought was a
shit.
Exactly. I thought that was a good adaptation. That actually was a maladaptation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in order to survive physically, I actually had to destroy the building blocks of a healthy life.
Yeah.
Trust, respect, honesty, all of those things I had to destroy in order to survive physically. And so complex trauma, you usually don't see the consequences of it until 20, 30 years later.
Yeah.
When life starts falling apart.
In my field, we call it the drip, and it's the cortisol drip.
Yes.
And so a child is at home, maybe they're not eating breakfast, maybe an abusive household, maybe an abusive sibling, whatever the case, maybe not getting your needs met, right? There's no physical touch. There's something not being met. And so we call it the drip, and a constant, it's not one big event, but this constant drip of cortisol, that stress hormone, always in your brain. And when you're trying to build those building blocks and those structures in your brain, we know that children are humans, but children especially, they're building those blocks for connection. And then when you're pounded with cortisol for so long, you go into protection, and your brain actually changes the structure.
Exactly.
And then we have adults, right? And adults going to you, Tim, going, I need some support and help, which is why your work is so important. And it's easier to build a child than to rebuild an adult, but we all need a little help rebuilding, right? And so that hit of cortisol, even a little bit every day, completely impacts us. And I'd love to know more what you think about this, but in our society where we go, you have trauma and you're behaving this way, and I find that there's a lack of empathy and understanding. If it's not an injury we can physically see, you don't have a broken leg, your arm is not broken, you don't have any scars. But when we interact with other adults and we go, what? Like, they're so sensitive, or they shut down, right? The fight, like fawn, flight. Like we lose our understanding and empathy when we can't see a physical injury. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, and I think our society sadly has put a stigma around anything you can't see that might be a problem. So mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and then trauma. I could just get over it. And so we've been so focused on doing the right external actions. Nobody's cared about the internal world of why we do those actions or what's going on there. You should just be able to somehow flip a switch and do the right thing all the time. Yeah. And if you can't, then you're the problem. And so that's why I really appreciated Dr. Bruce Perry's books, What Happened to You? Because he said, if you look at all the social institutions of our society today that are working with the homeless, working with the corrections world, working with domestic violence, working with children in care, our normal response is, what's wrong with you? Smarten up. Mm-hmm. And there's a stigma, there's a judgment that goes with that. He says, we got to change the question and start asking, what happened to you? You're just displaying ways of trying to cope with something that happened early on. And let's take the stigma out. Let's not just be focusing on changing the symptoms. Let's let's actually work with the core issues. And if you look at social institutions, it's basically putting Band-Aids on symptoms. And so the whole thing is to realize, no, these are all coping strategies that came out of trauma. And so if we don't help people understand the trauma, heal from the trauma, and learn healthy coping, then they're just going to keep doing the same stuff no matter how much you tell them to smarten up.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the topics that you and Theo kind of got into, and it's something that's affected me my whole life. So I had a great family, but they were angry outwardly, not towards me, but to society. And so I turned into the mediator. And then, like you talked about on Theo, I became the guy, and it has helped me in my career vastly because I've helped children with behavior for 30 some years. But what ended up happening is that I became whatever the people around me needed, so that, and I didn't realize it now, this is something that I've through therapy figured out, so that I would feel safe. I always thought that I was just helping people, that I was just really good at identifying maybe their whys or what's going on or their triggers, and I was able to help them understand their trigger, move forward, embrace it, and do what I should have been doing all along. So what I ended up doing was a mask. I started masking myself. And even I remember in high school and elementary school, I would find a friend. And then if they liked the Rolling Stones, I would learn everything there was to know about the Rolling Stones. And then I became an expert. If they loved gymnastics, I became the best gymnastics person ever. I just would adapt myself. And then as I became an adult, not maybe to that extent, I would always make sure that everyone around me was calm. And if I saw someone in the room getting upset, I was the first one to go and deal with it. So can you tell me how masking relates to childhood, to complex trauma?
Yeah, so this will be a little longer answer, but I want to go back to Montana and what she talked about.
Everyone does, actually.
The first response of the brain to danger is cortisol, which gives you the energy to fight or flight. It makes you stronger and faster. It turbocharges your whole system to fight or flight. The problem with a child is they're too little to fight and they're too little to flight. So they've got cortisol. Oh, and cortisol was designed to be a one-time burst for one-time danger. And it would get you fight or flight. You would get to a safe place again. Cortisol would stop. You would be back to a regulated nervous system. The problem with complex trauma is cortisol is dripping every day. And the brain was not designed to have cortisol dripping every day. So now the child's stress system is constantly being activated. They're constantly in fight or flight. That determines brain development. You can't connect when cortisol's dripping because you can't stay present. You got to get out of here. The present isn't safe. And so the problem then is what happens when a child's too little to fight or flight? Well, the brain then introduces another chemical called natural opioids. And basically it says, I can't escape to an external world through fight or flight. So let's escape to an internal world. So opioids do two things. They enable you to disconnect and go internally, and they numb pain. So they bring all of the blood from your extremities. So cortisol pumps everything to your extremities, adds sugar to your blood so that you can have extra energy. Opioids brings all the blood around your heart and says, get ready to get hurt or cut. And I'm going to numb the pain. And you're not going to bleed as much. And you can escape into a disconnect, dissociative internal world. But what dissociation has a spectrum of mild to extreme. So the extreme is that extreme out-of-body experience, split off into different personalities, dissociative identity disorder stuff. But the mild stuff is, I got all this energy that's being pumping in my body. I just got to be busy. I got to have distraction. All of it so I don't have to be present in the present. Anything that helps me kind of temporarily escape from my body. So you get ADHD coming out of that. You get just that person that gets validated for being a workaholic, for being constantly organizing, cleaning, all of those things begin to happen, but they're all escapes from the present,
Yes.
and they're a form of dissociation. What then happens? So there's a fourth F. So you got fight, flight. That didn't work. You go to freeze, which is the dissociation. But the child, if they're little, they still need mom and dad to meet their needs. But mom and dad are hurting them. So what do? Well, you got to learn to fawn. You got to learn to mask. You got to learn to be what they want you to be, so they'll like you enough to take care of you. And so that's where children become experts at becoming attuned to other people better than I'm attuned to myself. I'll be attuned to what you think, what you believe, what you feel, and I'll adjust to you. And I can attune to everybody within a millisecond, and I can quickly figure out what I got to become and be a chameleon in order for you to like me, in order for you to want to be my friend and meet my needs. And so fawning becomes kind of if you look at it as the 4 F's, it becomes actually the most extreme form of survival. It's the last ditch desperate attempt of the brain to try to keep a child safe. But what happens with that is the child has to lose who they are to become what everybody else wants them to be. They have to basically shut down many parts of themselves, their needs, their gut, their thinking, their emotions, in order to become what everybody else wants. So they got to lose themselves. Mm-hmm. And that becomes the ultimate kind of tragedy that comes out of that. To survive physically, you got to lose yourself in every other way.
Yeah, I remember, and I still do, now that I understand it a little bit better. So through therapy, I remember the moment when I was talking to her about masking, because she had realized that she felt I had ADHD, but she also felt I had trauma. And I was like, what are you talking about? My life was great. I've never had trauma in my life. And then she started unpacking. Yeah, she started unpacking. Well, she's like, well, remember this. And I'm like, well, yeah, but that was nothing. She's
That's
like,
normal.
In everyone else's world, that one thing is trauma. In your world, that's just a day that ends in Y. And so then we got into masking, and I was talking about that. And then I remember the moment when I stopped and I said, but what if no one likes me? Exactly. What if you don't like me? Exactly. I don't want to unmask. And I remember, and it still is, one of my biggest fears is because I internally feel that I can't possibly be liked.
Yeah.
Is that a factor?
Yes, it's a huge factor. So if you look back at a child's needs not being met and they're getting hurt, the child sees everything from a very egocentric perspective, and it's basically, it must be my fault. I must be not good enough. I must not be lovable. But what they're believing with that, and so it's all lies, but what they're believing is that anybody that gets to know me is going to treat me like mom and dad are. They're going to reject me. They're not going to meet my needs. So therefore now my highest priority is to hide what I think is the real me. And I need to create a pseudo persona that I think others will like. And so that core identity, which was shaped by trauma, which says I'm not lovable, I'm not good enough, I don't have value, we call shame. It's that core belief that, to me, is the greatest tragedy that comes out of complex trauma. Because a child who connects in a healthy, safe environment, they have wonderful self-identity. I am lovable, I am valuable. Complex trauma, reverse, negative self-identity. Something's wrong with me. Anybody gets to know me, they're going to reject me. So I got to hide and I got to perform. And my value isn't because of who I am. My value now is based on what I do. So I'm no longer a human being. I'm now a human doer. And if I don't perform properly and have the right externals, then people aren't going to like me. And so that shame basically is a belief, but it results in this huge fear that anybody that gets to know me will reject me. And that shapes every relationship and everything I do.
Oh, yeah. It all comes into your relationships later in life, and work, friendships, like everything is impacted. Every single thing. I did a program, ACE. So adverse, childhood experiences. Yep. And I would teach it to educators, and, it compiled the resources and everything. And, you learn a lot about yourself when you're teaching that. You're like,
exactly.
yeah.
Maybe Montana, if you don't mind, because I kind of know what ACE is because Tim's talked about it quite a bit.
Yeah.
Explain what it is. It's a list that helps identify.
Yeah, it's benchmarks. And so in my field, for educators and parents, we take this compiled research, we look at these benchmarks. And for us, we use it as a tool to basically interact and educate children in a way where we are watching for this. And where, for me, it's not even necessarily the day-to-day interactions. That's not my job to look over with ACE. So this compiled program and research. It is to, like, what is happening today? And I want all of my educators to think, what is this child going to look like when they're 40? Like, I need them to, like, because we know that childhood trauma impacts your employment. It impacts your relationships, your romantic relationships. It impacts your relationship with food. It impacts your relationship if people give you feedback. Are you defensive? Are you okay with it? Like, are you fawning? And so there's this whole huge unearthing of this, little t and big T trauma and what that looks like for me. Productivity, like if I'm sitting, you don't find me sitting actually. Like my value as a human and a woman is I am successful. I'm always working. I have 100 jobs. It's a lot to work through. It's a lot to work through.
So ACE, it's 10 questions, and it's really designed to. It really focuses more on big T trauma, and so to me, it's got great value. But in the world that I work in, like we use the ACE test with people all the time, but we've added 50 other questions that help them detect the subtler forms of little T trauma that they wouldn't see from just doing the ACE test.
You've created 60 characteristics.
Yeah, and then we've created 60 questions. So taken the 10 ACE questions and added 50 more that explore kind of family dynamics and cultural dynamics that could have created a feeling of lack of safety for a child.
Because ACE itself is the big ones, like were you sexually assaulted by someone in your family? Did you
alcoholism? It's the thing.
Alcoholism. So it deals in the macro points of impact in your life, which, we just talked to Todd Blyleven, who was at the Vegas shooting. He had a massive PTSD from it. And it was interesting when I was talking to him, which, he's just such a giving, kind man who is now using Walking Tall to reach other people who are suffering through trauma. But I mentioned a small trauma I had, and he said, no, that is no different than what I'm going through, because at the end of the day, we are both reacting to it in our own personal way, and it is important. Maybe talk on that a little bit, because I think that's, when you talk to people and you say, I have PTSD or I have trauma, they're like, oh yeah, were you did you fall out of a plane? Did you? And then you're like, well, no, I had a tough childhood. And they're like, oh, no.
You're like, everyone has had a tough childhood.
Exactly.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
So I would say two things to that. So number one, a lot of people, when they hear little T trauma, they think insignificant then. And I go, no, little T trauma is just as significant to the brain as big T trauma. So you got to get kind of past that. But the reason many people think of it is the way that many families responded to a child being hurt or unsafe was to minimize it. Oh, get over it. You're not as bad as other kids. Toughen up. This is life. And you're not as bad as somebody in Africa. Like, your life is good. So you get trained to respond to pain by minimizing it or even denying it. And if it's the normal for everybody, it's easy to do. And so part of what we do is help people go, okay, but let's go back to little James. What was he feeling? How did it affect him on that day?
The little James. The
little James.
Come here.
Yeah, and so let's get past the minimizing. Let's get past rationalizing. And let's start to look at it accurately and look at it through the eyes of that little boy at that point in time. Because what most do who've got more severe complex trauma, they can see another child getting beaten and they can have great compassion for that child. But when they think of themselves getting beaten, they go, psst. They have zero feelings.
Right.
Like, just get over it. Toughen up. And so they're not able to extend self-compassion to themselves, but they can extend it to others. And it's really realizing, wow, something happened in there that cut you off from your own pain, and acknowledging your own pain. And so we got to start by being able to reaccess honestly what that pain is, if it's ever going to heal. Because you can't heal pain by denying it or minimizing it. You can only heal pain by looking at it accurately and validating.
Which is not easy.
It's very difficult.
No.
Everything in us resists it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to, sorry, Montana, I'll let you go in just a sec. I'd like to kind of transition. I think we have a really good idea what complex trauma is and how crazy and insane James is. But I'd like to get into the recovery aspect on it, because you've done a lot of groundbreaking work in the recovery aspect. And, changing it. We were talking to Todd Blyleven, and like I said, he was in the mass shooting, and he talked about how he worked with his therapist in minute increments. And what she would do is she would take him back to that time in that minute, and he would experience, what the floor felt like, what it smelled like, what he was seeing. And then they would pull away from it, and they would just discuss that part.
Right.
How is that similar to what we're going to do when we start exploring our childhood and the things that affected us that have transferred into our adulthood life?
There's definitely an important piece there. So what we've learned about children is that when they get hurt and they come home and it's a healthy home and they cry to mom and they talk, they only usually process it for about a minute.
Right.
Then they go off and play. And then tomorrow they come up and cry a bit more and talk a bit more, and then they're off to play. And so the danger that's really happened in our culture is you go for counseling and it's a 50-minute hour. And so you got to talk about it for 50 minutes.
Right.
But we're not made to process for 50 minutes straight. Most people are made to process for a minute. And then they need a break from it. And then if you get an addict on top of that, who basically, I got to do everything 110%, and then you get a perfectionist that I got to do everything perfectly, is basically what they begin to think is, I got to do recovery 24/7. I got to be submerged in this. I never take a break. I just got to work on this time fixed. And they burn themselves out and they overwhelm themselves. And it's realizing, no, you got to pace yourself. You got to do it in small doses. And that just becomes such an important piece in people realizing you don't have to do this all at once, all in one sitting. This can take chunks of time over years.
Yeah, and I think that's important. So we often want to walk in and get that quick fix. Right. And that is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to walk in, her to tell me my answer. You have ADHD, you have this, you have that. I could walk away and then it's solved. I don't have to worry about it anymore. And that, in fact, was not what happened. What happened was it got worse before it got better.
Exactly.
It really did, because I would leave each session, which you said 50 minutes. 50 minutes is not a long time to talk about something, identify something, process it with a trained professional. You leave and you're still processing. Yeah. It takes a long time. It takes days to process it. And you have to be very careful afterwards, because you can get into, where you displace that to someone else, or you even worse, you hold it in even more, because now it's open and raw. That's something that you haven't thought about. What do you do for that transition? Like when people leave you?
Yeah, so I would back up first and say this. So a lot of people, when we first started working with trauma, realized that, okay, got to validate the trauma. We got to go back and help the person reprocess it and see it from an adult perspective now, and it wasn't their fault, and that they're not helpless now. They do have tools now, so they can resolve this. And so what people wanted to do is take people right back into their pain right away. And what people first need is tools or agency that they're going to be able to regulate the emotions that get triggered, and they're going to get dysregulated. They're going to have a lot of fear. And so if they don't have those tools up front, taking them back to their pain without those tools is actually doing damage. Yeah. And it's going to send them spiraling even further downhill. So we got to be patient as therapists and say we got to just spend time giving people agency first before we ever take them to that. But then we have to help them realize that you need to work through stuff. You need the education and self-awareness of what happened to you. But all of complex trauma came about in some way connected to lack of attachment. And so healing is not just about getting information and about talking through your trauma and reprocessing it. Healing is reconnecting with one safe person. Mm-hmm. And so you need to have that one safe person that you can go and talk to, that you can cry with, that you can just be with and not have them try to fix you, not have them try to psychoanalyze you, just be there and support you and walk with you. You need that connection if you're going to make it in this journey. To try to do it just on your own usually just gets too overwhelming for people. So what I saw when I began was a lot of programs really were what I would say were PTSD related. And they were about dealing with kind of that dysregulation stuff and learning to regulate. And that's super important. And that's that giving that initial agency to people. But what I saw for most places is they didn't deal with the C-PTSD, which is all the maladaptations that people have been doing since they're 5 years old or 3 years old. And the shame piece, that core identity that got all messed up, programs weren't dealing with that. And then the fears, the fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection, the fear of the unknown, the fear of change, fear of intimacy, like just on and on. And so it was, we need a program that, yes, gives the agency, helps with the regulation, but it's got to get to those core issues that came out of complex trauma, the shame issues, the abandonment issues, all of that. If people are going to do the deep, deep healing, because I've seen so many people that get agency, they can regulate their emotions, but they don't deal with the shame, they don't deal with the fear of abandonment. They're getting triggered every other day, and they spend their life trying to regulate. But they haven't dealt, so they're still just dealing with symptoms. They're still not dealing with the core issues. And so that's where with our programs, it's just, we got to help people with the core issues. But the problem with that is those are the most painful issues. Those are the ones we most resist working on, because the fear is, if I deal with my shame, then I'm going to get honest about what I think I am. And if I reveal what I think I am, then everybody's going to reject me. So I got to walk through a ton of fear to get to healing. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I want to do that. And I'm going to therefore get worse before I get better. Yeah, that's how this is going to work. And so it's a lot of initial resistance that people have to be willing to fight through.
Especially since at the time, like, I really do feel like I'm coping well. People like me. People come to me when they need help, and I'm able to help them. And that was kind of what was happening in therapy as I became raw. And instead of dealing with that raw, because, you know, I had my tool bag. So my tool bag is go eat some ice cream or go help someone in a major way. I would find that person that I know needed, a lot of help, and I would contact them and go, hey, what's going on? Because I knew they would need me. And then I get that positive reinforcement from them saying, James, you're amazing. It's so great that you're there. Or I'd buy a bunch of people coffee because, I noticed they were sad or something. And that was my tool bag. And it wasn't until later that I realized that I can't solve my problems by getting that dopamine effect by helping others, because it's not about them. I'm not trying to help them. I'm trying to help me. And I didn't realize that at all. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I would say most people that come out of complex trauma don't understand healthy self-care. They think they do. They think they have a toolkit. So self-care for them is dissociate, just be a blob on the couch, eat food, have sex, help everybody, get validation, do some adrenaline junkie activity. There, I've done my self-care. And no, you haven't. Self-care is learning to meet all of my emotional, physical, intellectual, relational needs in a healthy way. Most don't have a clue how to do that. Secondly, most people, so in your nervous system, you have your sympathetic, your activity, energy part. Then you have your parasympathetic, your rest and healing part. Complex trauma keeps you in your sympathetic because you're on guard, you're in survival mode. True self-care happens when you're in parasympathetic. And when you're relaxing, resting truly because you're safe, because your needs are met and because you're connected to safe people. Most people from complex trauma try to do self-care in their sympathetic nervous system. Your body can't heal when you're in your sympathetic. Your body's not in the place where it's truly being able to care for itself. And so people have to relearn self-care. And that's a bit of a challenge. That's a bit of work because we've got these default setting in our brain. Oh, I'm tired. I'm going to do this. And we just slide back into old behaviors that we think are self-care, and they make us feel better for a minute, but they haven't really met our deepest needs. And so the discontent, the lack of fulfillment is still working away below the surface. So it's a huge challenge for people to learn. You can't do recovery well because it's very demanding. It is very exhausting emotionally. You can't do recovery well unless you learn self-care well.
Right.
And so you got to have the right ingredients as you go along if you're going to survive the recovery journey.
So for me, like I said, it's a toolbox. So I have a hammer, and my hammer is go eat. So I found I wanted to solve them all. I know what they all are now. I'm going to fix them all. Right. So then, my go-to, like I said, was helping people. So I stopped helping everyone. Well, that's not a freaking answer.
Right.
Or, I limited my food to such a point that I probably was starving myself at one point because I would think in my head, oh, I'm just doing this because I'm suffering from trauma. I'm not hungry. Well, no, sometimes you are hungry. It's a thing, James. You can eat. So how do I do that? How do I, obviously I have to recognize what tools I'm using and why I'm using.
Yeah.
That's important. But how do I not swing the pendulum so far that I'm actually doing more damage than good?
Exactly. And so that's what most people do when they realize that their existing tools aren't working, is they just do the opposite. They swing the pendulum and they think that's going to solve it. But they're just changing the symptoms. They're just going from this symptom. They haven't dealt with the core issue yet.
Yeah.
And so that's where you also get a person who, oh, I'm too giving. I always say yes to people. Okay, I'm never going to say yes to anybody again. I'm going to have boundary. And the pendulum just swang. Or, you know what? I always date these funny, outgoing people. So now I'm going to date somebody that's serious all the time. Pendulum just swang. You just haven't dealt with, why did you date that person? What was going on deep down inside that attracted you to that person? And so until people begin to realize we got to get beyond just trying to change the symptoms and seeing them as the problem, to go, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why do I cope this way? Why is this the only tool I have in my toolkit? Are there different tools that are actually healthy? Now, if you haven't had anybody to mentor that or to model that for you or teach you healthy tools, you're not going to just magically figure it out on your own. You got to go to somebody else who can help you. And that's where in recovery, you need a mentor, you need a surrogate family, you need a therapist of people that can role model for you and teach you what healthy living looks like. So most of the people I work with, they come in and they go, okay, I got anger issues. My relationships are falling apart. My kids hate me. I need help. And so they think they've diagnosed their problems. And I go, yeah, you've diagnosed the symptoms. Now we're going to look at the problem. And then they go, whoa, I'm more screwed up than I thought I am. And I'm really unhealthy. So they're really getting an understanding of healthy. But then they go to, okay, what's healthy look like? I don't have a clue what healthy looks like. Nobody's ever shown me what's healthy.
Yeah.
And then they realize there's a whole new chapter of learning beyond just diagnosing unhealthy and breaking that down to understanding healthy. Like, that's brand new. Now, the problem for a lot of people is a child in a healthy home, when do they learn what healthy is? From age 0 to age 20, basically.
Mm-hmm.
What happens for people in complex trauma recovery, most of them come in at 30, 40, 50, 60, and they're learning now at 60 years old what they should have been learning at 2 years old. And they go, I feel so stupid. I feel like should have the dunce cap on. And they beat themselves up that they're learning so late in life what they should have learned 40, 50 years ago. And it's again realizing, whoa, quit beating yourself up. You were trying to survive back then. You adapted and to survive. Don't beat up that child, but just be thankful you got an opportunity now to learn what healthy is. And don't expect to learn it overnight. Would take a child 20 years to learn healthy. You're not going to learn it in a week. You got to give yourself a lot of time to gradually understand what this healthy life looks like.
Yeah, all of that is totally true. I like the fact that you keep on going back. This is not something you can do alone. Because I specifically, because I'm stubborn and I have helped so many other people, obviously I know how to do it, so I can do it.
Did you try to do it alone, James, at first? Yeah.
For years, I went in depth and I studied everything because I know about psychology, I know about behavior, I've helped children. So I went back and I listened to people like Tim Fletcher and I listened to internal family systems. I did all this work. And what I realized was I am not outside of it, I'm inside of it. And like you said, my go-to is to attack myself. So if I uncover something that happened in my childhood, I would immediately say either, wow, I've wasted so much time. That's obviously why, my relationships didn't work. I'm a terrible person. And I didn't have the 360 view that a therapist had. The only thing I will add, and I've added it so many times on Soaring Prophets, is you may not find the right therapist right away.
Exactly.
Or the right program right away. Not every program is going to work because we're all different, unique people. Don't give up. Exactly. You'll go in. In fact, I'm going to be honest right now. I went to therapy for 2 years with an amazing therapist who I love. We got to that point where I said, what if no one likes me? She had a great response. It was amazing. I have not been back. Because I got to that point.
You got to that point in therapy, and then you stopped going to therapy.
Yes.
I'm learning so much about you today.
Yes. Yeah, I know. Watch Soaring Prophets, and you'll find out all about James. But that was just it. I got that point, and I looked over the cliff, and I was like, no one's going to like me. Yeah. So, you know what? I have enough information. I know I probably have ADHD. I have, complex trauma. I know psychology. I can handle this. It's going to be fine. And to a certain extent, I was kind of right, but I'm not right. Yeah. I let my fear attack me in such a way that I ran away. Are you finding that in your work at React?
Very much so. A lot of people will come in and they'll go, like, they've diagnosed what they think is their problem. So I got addiction. If I fix my addiction, then life supposedly is going to be perfect. Or I got anger issues. If I fix that, then I'm going to have a perfect marriage, or my kids will love me. And so yes, you got those issues, but those are symptom of deeper issues. So as they begin to realize there's shame, there's fear of abandonment, there's deep wounds that they got to get honest about. That's where a lot of people will go, I don't know if I want it this badly.
Right.
Because this is going to be a lot of pain and a lot of hard work, and it scares me to death. Yeah. And I don't know if I can get through it. I feel I'm going to open a can of worms that are just going to take over my life in a negative way. And they walk away. And so that's why, to me, what we see with people is, once they start to get the real issues, it's almost a weeding out process begins to happen. Only the really, really serious stick at it as you go deeper and deeper. Now, that doesn't mean the other people haven't benefited. They've got some information that's going to, like planting seeds, it's going to work away. They may come back later. They may kind of do some other stuff that's going to help them move a little bit further. But there are little hiccups on the road that happen as soon as you realize your next issue is pretty scary, and I'm not sure I want to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I would add to what you said is, don't be afraid to try different therapists, because not every therapist is going to work for everybody. And part of the challenge to me with that is there's still so many therapists today that are trauma informed but don't really understand trauma.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so they use some old modalities of healing that might work in certain settings with people, but they don't usually work well with trauma people. And so you're going to go into, somebody's got their PhD and all of that, but they use a modality that's not going to work for you, and you're going to get very frustrated. The danger is to go back to that child and think it's my fault.
Yes.
I just need to change, and then, because there can't be anything wrong with the therapist.
No.
And it's
They're
realizing
smart.
in many ways our mental health healing system is actually quite broken in places, and it's quite behind in at the professional level in being up to date on some of the understanding that we're starting to have. And so I just encourage clients all the time, don't be down on yourself if you feel you have to fire your therapist.
I have
So
fired
true.
many, so yeah, do it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so true. At the end of the day, whether it's your doctor, your psychologist, or, if you were going to lawn care and the guy didn't cut your grass properly, you would fire him.
Yeah.
And this is the same. You need to know whether or not therapy is helping or hurting. Tim, I want to talk to you all day, every day, because you are insightful. And like I said before in the green room, you say it in such a way that you bring all the clinicianal words and all the language that is hard to understand that a lot of therapists I talk to talk in. You bring it down to like almost just an easy level to understand.
Yeah, you make it
much like, go ahead.
You make it accessible.
Yeah, you make it accessible and understandable and usable. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on here. Like therapy, though, it has to end at some point, and I feel like I'm wanting more. Profiteers out there, one of the reasons I wanted Tim Fletcher so bad was because a lot of you have reached out to me in my DMs, and I've talked to you, and we've gone through some of the things you're going through. I am not a therapist like I tell you then, and that you should always seek a trained therapist. But a common thread, I think, is this complex childhood trauma. And I think it's something that we all should be looking into more, because I think it affects more people than we think. And I think it's an important thing to know yourself if you want to be in the world that we're around, and stop, looking for the next thing. I know myself, I struggle. So later today, I will have a couple of hours that I will have nothing to do. The laundry's done, the dishes are done, everything's done. And immediately my anxiety rises.
Yes.
I start feeling like something's wrong, and I start searching for things that are wrong. It's a thing. And then I replace it with the tools that I've created through my childhood to make myself feel safe. If you're feeling this way, make sure that you reach out to Tim at React, or go talk to someone. Like I say over and over and over again, you don't have to go. Your first step doesn't have to be talking to a therapist. Go talk to someone you trust. Because when we have mental health problems, we want to withdraw. Just last week, Todd talked about, at first he withdrew. He pulled away from everyone. He stopped seeing friends. He stopped talking to family. He wanted to be alone. That is the worst thing you can do when you're suffering from mental health. You need to go talk to someone. And I'm telling you right now, I told you last week, I was going through like pretty severe trauma in my life, and I was terrified to tell anyone, mainly because I'm a man and I can handle everything. And I went to Pat on knees crying. Pat, and you all know Pat, no serious straight shooter guy. I opened myself to him, and not only did he not reject me, he embraced me. He loves me. He cares for me as a deep, deep friend, and we've been brothers ever since. Go do it. It's the best thing you'll ever do. Profiteers out there, let's heal our minds and bodies and souls together. You know I love you all. Montana, can you give us some few words?
Yes, I can. First of all, Tim, thank you so much. As the introvert, I love being put on the spot. Let's just get that covered. Tim, thank you so much for your time today. I think this is a really, trauma is so widely discussed and so misunderstood still. It is in the pulp culture. We have memes and, we have like Instagram and we have influencers talking about it. And it's so good to have someone who actually understands it, who actually has experience and can show their work in real time for it. So thank you so much for being here. I watched a bunch of your videos, so I was fangirling a little bit. So thank you so much. And I need to do one of those, James, those lines, right?
Yes, your little sign off.
My sign off is super corny, but it is never look down on someone unless you're helping them up. So, which is something Pat would never say that. So you're welcome.
You know what? He would never say it, but he does it all the time.
He does it. This is why we still talk to him.
That's why we still talk to him. I know. It's the only reason. Tim, we always, first of all, I want you to tell us a little bit about how we get in touch with React and just about that in general. And then at the end, we always do a thing where we reach out to our profiteers. And in your case, maybe reach out to someone who may be just now discovering that I may have complex trauma. What is the best advice you could give to them at that moment when they realize it?
So first of all, the React was initially set up as an in-person treatment center.
Right.
And so when we had to put stuff online, we changed the name to Lift for the online treatment program.
Yeah.
So React is still the in-person, Lift is the online. So that's what's accessible to most people. So if they go to our website, timfletcher.ca, they can find out about the Lift program. And we have different options as far as taking Lift that are available to people that make it more accessible, because it's not accessible 5 days a week for everybody. So just to be aware of, you're looking for the Lift program, probably, if you're listening to this. What I would say...
But they should go to timfletcher.ca. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I would say to people that just are realizing it is, number one, to me, everybody has some form of complex trauma, mild to severe, but everybody's got some mild stuff, because every child went through having some needs not met adequately, not connecting perfectly. And so they've got some stuff that they developed adaptations that are now messing up their life. So if you can take the stigma out of it to say, I've got complex trauma, it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't mean you are screwed up, messed up, beyond hope, terrible in any way. It's just, you got some stuff that you need to deal with. And the second piece is, many people that come out of trauma without even realize it, there's a hopelessness that they feel that just comes with the trauma, because the child couldn't resolve their problems and their pain. So they developed a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And so a lot of people, when they hear I've got trauma, without realizing it, they go to feeling helpless and hopeless. Mm-hmm. And it's realizing, no, there's great hope. There's wonderful tools available. There's wonderful guides available. Reach out for help. It's there.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Profiteers out there, if you have any comments, we will pass them on. You have questions, we'll pass them on. Please do comment and question, like, subscribe, share. Thank you, Montana, for being such a gracious and beautiful guest host. I am hoping that we can do this in the future. Maybe start a little show of our own. Profiteers out there, you know I love you. Take care.